Honourable Ruth Dyson.
Mr Speaker, I recall when this legislation was first introduced and I suggested to the Minister that he stay in his seat, that he not stand up, because I was about to say that I supported legislation that he'd introduced, and I'm delighted actually that at this stage our support is able to be returned. In between, we unfortunately had to withdraw it because it was clear during the Select Committee process that the balance had not been obtained to the level that Labour thought was appropriate. I'm also delighted that Minister Jerry Brownlee and I assume his associate, the Honourable Nicky Wagner, both listened to the submitters, took a lot of time and trouble and made an effort to engage with all other parties in the House, to the point now that I understand with the tabling of the supplementary order paper from the Minister, this bill will receive unanimous support of Parliament. That is the sort of message that I am delighted Parliament will give to Canterbury. It's not a message that we've had a lot in the past, in the last 5.5 years, and I'm delighted that this is the opportunity for us to do it, and it's been taken by the Minister. 5 years ago, not much longer than 5 years ago, in the February quake of 2011, events happened in our city that really redefined Canterbury and its residents. We had loss of thousands of homes and 185 lives. The fact that Parliament is able to come together for the recovery stage of that experience should be a tribute to those people who lost their lives and to their families, and I just want to acknowledge them. At that time, thousands of New Zealanders rallied to support Canterbury, and I've reflected a lot, particularly around the 22nd of February commemorations, about the little things that happened that meant so much to people at the time. Of course, there were big things that happened as well. As my colleague Megan Woods said, we did have military everywhere, and as Dr Woods would know, that wasn't such a bad thing for many in our city. Many enjoyed the companionship, but also the feeling of security that it gave. It wasn't an intimidating process at all. Even the fact that we had tanks parked in the middle of our roads, which sounds bizarre now, was reassuring for people. It gave us comfort to know that competent professionals were there. It was the first time in our history that every single state and the federal government of Australia sent police to assist our country, and that is that is something that we shouldn't forget. And of course, the first country that sent assistance was Japan, who not long after tragically needed assistance of their own in a much bigger event. But we had many people in New Zealand who performed small acts of generosity that made such a big difference to the well-being. And Parliament, of course, responded in a way that we are now considering in this legislation, because Parliament responded with the establishment of Sarah. We don't have women called Sarah in Canterbury, we have Sarah as an organisation. It's caused a lot of confusion, and could I recommend to all ministers that they never have an organisation that can be confused with a woman's name, because every time we say Sarah in Christchurch, we say, no, Sarah the department, not the person. It's a silly name. But it wasn't a silly organisation. It was set up for good reasons. It gave wartime powers to the Minister, and he needed some of them. Some of them he used appropriately as well, and some of them he didn't need to use, but they were given to him in all good faith from Parliament, because we thought they may have been necessary. In the end, it didn't work quite as Parliament envisaged. The good things and bad things, but certainly some good people. And talking of good people, I want to pay a tribute to Michelle Mitchell, who was an outstanding leader, not just in Sarah, the organisation, but actually in the public service. Tragically lost her life, a huge loss to the public service in Canterbury, a huge loss to the community. She was an outstanding leader and deserves acknowledgement during this process. So this legislation now is the next step, and it is a genuine step change, which is what we have needed for quite some time. The Minister talked about some of the iterations that have led to this. The group led by Dame Jenny Shipley, who members might be surprised to learn that I have a great deal of time and respect for, don't share a single political belief, but in terms of her competence and passion, she's been outstanding and I think led that process towards this legislation with courage. You know, she's a pretty fearless person, even the minister wouldn't scare her. That's right. Got agreement there pretty swiftly. I also want to acknowledge our three mayors, the Honourable Leanne Dalzell, David Ayres and Kelvin Coe. They have been extraordinary contributors, not just to this process, but to the much broader recovery in Christchurch. All three areas are at different stages. Of course, Waimakariri area and Selwyn far more adversely affected by the September 2010 quake than by the February 2011 quake. So, you know, we're able to get some things started, and they're smaller areas and they had a different sort of loss, but they have faced huge challenges, and I really admire the mayors of the three areas and the councillors for the commitment that they've demonstrated. I also want to acknowledge the community forum, which I understand has played a really pivotal role in the minister's thinking. I regret that the Canterbury members of Parliament didn't have any engagement with them. They were pretty well kept out of sight from us, even though they were established under the legislation as a means of communicating community messages to the minister. But I have heard that the minister thinks highly of the work they've done, so they certainly should be acknowledged. I know that their chairman was recognised in the recent New Zealand Honours, and that was a good thing. I also want to acknowledge Tamark Solomon and Dame Margaret Baisley, who again have played a critical role from their perspective and their part in the Canterbury recovery. Mr. Speaker, looking specifically at the bill and where we go through from here, we've had a substantial supplementary order paper signalled by the Minister, and I look forward to seeing it and hearing the debate in the committee stages. But as I said earlier, it has acknowledged the deficiencies that were in the bill. It has responded to the submitters and Canterbury leaders' call for genuine transition to local leadership, and I have confidence that the Minister's word will be met by the detail in the supplementary order paper, and we'll certainly be looking at it carefully. There are other parts of this bill that also deserve acknowledgement. One of the big tasks that will face the bodies that are being established under this legislation is determining the future of the residential red zone. That has more significance than disposal of land, and I want to acknowledge the way that Waimakariri Council has led community discussion about this. People didn't just have a wrecked house and leave. They had a wrecked house. They often had loss to life within their family. Pretty well everyone in Canterbury knew somebody who died. But they were then told that their house could not be rebuilt in the area that they'd been living in for many years, and that loss is not able to be easily described to people who weren't part of that process. Living in a red zone became something of you can't explain it to people that weren't there actually at the time. So the process of determining what happens in the future to that land needs to involve the people who are displaced as a result, not of the quakes, but of the Minister's decision to zone that land, I think quite appropriately, in most cases, red, but it needs to involve them because they have left a part of their life in that spot where their home was. They left their neighbours and their community. The other big part of the job that's ahead of us in Canterbury is the anchor projects. Some of them are still hotly debated. You know, I'm not a great fan of sitting outside on a cold winter's night watching the Crusaders win. I'd much rather sit in comfort in a lounge. So the idea of, if we're going to have a stadium, to have it covered is quite attractive. But that sort of money as a priority has never been, I've never been able to be persuaded on it, particularly when I look at the significant loss that has been inflicted on Otago because of their stadium. So we have debates about the anchor projects, but whatever the debate is, can we get on with some of them? There's only 5 out of 16, I think, that have made any progress, and they were the big stars of the previous area. So, Mr. Speaker, in conclusion, one other point that I want to make. In our community, we have something that's outside this legislation, but I hope the Minister takes up the charge. We want our school back on its home site in Redcliffs. It's a big part of our recovery, even though it isn't covered in the legislation, and I'm sure the Minister understands that need for community schools and genuine recovery from quakes. This is the step change that we need. I commend the Minister for his attention to the submissions and to other parties' concerns, and I commend this bill to the next stage.